College football nerds here talking LSU and Alabama. I got Josh here with me. This is a huge game. A couple weeks ago, we might not have thought that, but Alabama's struggling on the road, which makes this interesting. And LSU has kind of turned things around, putting a whooping on Ole Miss and taking care of business against Florida. I got a couple of notes for y'all. One, obviously, we need your score in the comments. But two, we're dropping a video on Wednesday that I think you might like. It's a hypothetical, Iowa versus Texas A&M, and you think those two teams, that's weird. But obviously, it's going to be kind of a silly, tongue-in-cheek thing. We're a little frustrated with what those two programs are doing offensively. So we decided to do a model about it to show how ridiculous these two teams are, and it won't show up in the normal search because nobody's on YouTube, because nobody's looking for that, but it's going to be in there. We're going to have some fun, so y'all check that out. And obviously the live show Saturday night. As this game is ending, we're going to be talking about this game, Georgia, Tennessee, everything else that's happened throughout the day. So just keep an eye out for that. All right, Josh, it's interesting to me. The feeling is LSU has turned things around, and I think it's fair to say that they have. And Alabama has yet to really put it together, especially on the road, offensively and defensively this year. Now, some of that is because Bryce Young got hurt against Arkansas. They were well on their way to blowing them out, putting it all together on the road. And then Texas A&M, Jalen Milroe, his first start, so there was a little bit of a herky-jerky thing there, especially with all the turnovers. This number is in double digits. A double-digit home dog in LSU or a road favorite for Alabama, if you want to look at it that way. Does that signal to you that Vegas kind of thinks that Alabama is going to put both things together, offensive and defensive, in the same game where we haven't seen it this year, given that we both feel that LSU is pretty well recovered from their early season struggles?
It's a bit surprising. So right now, the consensus I'm seeing is about 13 points for Alabama. And I think that number from certain books, it actually went from 12 to 13. And over-under is pretty low scoring, about 58 points. So they're saying it's going to be a low-scoring game. Really, they're saying they don't think LSU is going to score much, which is the interesting part. And we'll get into a model, but it seems to track with that a little bit. Vegas doesn't seem to give a lot of credence to the fact that Alabama has struggled a lot under the road. You can say if it's Bryce Young, if it's Bill O'Brien, but the past 2 years they have not played well on the road, and their offense has tended not to show up. And when the offense has played well, like the Tennessee game on the road, the defense doesn't show up. They can't seem to play a game against a good opponent that is good offensively and defensively at the same time. And that trend appeared again last week against Mississippi State. Again, same thing happened last year, and I'm not sure if it's a matter of playing up and down in the competition. I personally have a theory that it has a little bit to do with their offensive sort of identity kind of relying on how much they need to score in a game, right? That they just don't really put the pedal to the metal until they have to, and then otherwise they sort of lean on the defense to do what they need to do. So on days where the defense is playing well, the offense doesn't feel like they need to show up, and they just don't. But yeah, it's surprising to me that the margin is this high. It shows a lot more faith in Alabama than I think most people have right now. And I think LSU is a pretty sound, reasonable team. But I think as you get into the numbers, maybe also what it suggests is this idea that maybe LSU is just not quite on, maybe frankly just not quite on the same level statistically or in terms of scoring potential offensively and defensively. And maybe it's just more an indication of how good Alabama is, but it is definitely surprising on the road.
College Football Nerds has a sponsor for the 2022 college football season. It is Bird Dogs. You can check them out at birddogs.com. They make good-looking clothes for guys. And Josh, I recently went on vacation. It was in the Caribbean. My wife said you need to take a proper swimsuit. I didn't have any swimsuits, but I did have some Bird Dog shorts, and they are lined, so I say that counts as a proper swimsuit. I did use them to swim in the ocean, in the pool, but also could wear them around the cruise ship. And I felt like I looked a lot better than my fellow cruisers, at least the ones with the dad vibes, rocking the cargo shorts. And my wife approved, so okay, that's a good pass. But when I got home, had a little bit of a business trip, had my Bird Dog pants with me too. No pleats, no box cut. Looked pretty clean. Had a nice fit. So felt good about that too. But Josh, I think you've had some similar experiences with Bird Dogs.
Well, Daniel, I'm a simple nerd, and as a simple nerd, I struggle with figuring out how to make myself look fashionable. And I found that bird dogs do a good job of it. I mean, it. I obviously, I'm a fine specimen, but some days, having something that you can trot out that looks nice and is comfortable to wear is great. And bird dogs is really good because they have a lot of clothes that are good for casual occasions, and they've got stuff that's good for a business casual office like I'm in. And I've got the bird dogs shorts here, and you can see, I mean, they're good. They've got liner. They come in a lot of colors and styles. Some more or less flashy. You got pockets. Even got a little zipper pocket for geeks like me. But they don't look like cargo shorts, right? And that's I am that dork that wore cargo shorts pretty much all the way through high school and college. And to grow up a little bit and wear something a little nicer is a nice change of pace.
So go to birddogs.com, enter promo code NERDS. It was CFB Nerds, but now we're just going with Nerds because that's what we are. And they'll throw in a free Bird Dogs rope hat. That's birddogs.com, promo code NERDS, and boom, free Bird Dogs rope hat with your pair of Bird Dogs. The most comfortable shorts, pants, sweatpants with built-in liners. You're not going to want to take these things off, I promise. And guys, we don't do a lot of asks from y'all. We don't do a Patreon or anything like that, not even any merch yet. But one thing we do ask is when we have somebody that supports the channel, you support them as well. That's birddogs.com, promo code NERDS. And I think it might have to say more good about Alabama than bad about LSU, especially 45 and 45 the last two games. And look, Florida and Ole Miss don't have great defenses, but that was a Florida game on the road. And Ole Miss is not a dumpster fire defensively. So we've seen something from Daniels, I think, kind of really getting comfortable in this offense, and the wide receivers waking up a little bit. But the run game is where LSU has really shown out. And I think that might be why the number where it is and why people might be leaning a little bit to Alabama. We talk about matchups a lot. LSU needs to be able to run the ball really well. Alabama, for all their faults in the struggle game against Tennessee, I don't know that LSU is equipped offensively to exploit Alabama in the same way that Tennessee did. For them to put up 45, they need to run for 250, 300, and they're probably not going to do that against probably the best run defense in the country in Alabama, a good bit better than Georgia for what it's worth, and a good bit better than that Tennessee run defense that we both said is legit. So maybe that gets us into the model, maybe it gets into some discussion from your point, but is it a situation where LSU could really challenge on paper going into the game? They might still win this one, but in terms of challenging an elite team, maybe the matchups here are what's not favorable for LSU just because Alabama's run defense is the one thing that's pretty steady.
I think LSU's really found themselves through the ground game, and it's Daniels and his running ability early was part of the story, but as they got Emory back and were able to sort of balance out that backfield and the offensive line came together, they've gotten stronger. I think people take too much away from the Tennessee game. We said at the time, look, if you lose your left tackle and your left guard the morning of a game, you're going to be in serious trouble. And the offense just sort of collapsed in that game as a result. It completely took away their ability to run the football. And I'll say in the data that affects them, it'll also balance out a little bit because Alabama played a couple games without Bryce Young, which really affects them statistically too. So I don't think it's necessarily unfair one way or the other. No, we don't just factor out games where you had guys hurt. It's just too tough to do, frankly. There's not enough data points to do that and not skew your results too much the other direction. But yeah, I think LSU is a really good team. The receiving corps finally started to figure things out. It seems like everybody that has a transfer quarterback, like last year, Hendon Hooker took about 6-7 games before he became the guy that he started to become and became this year. Daniels has been the same way. Was not on the same page with the receivers. There's a lot of talk about frustration in that regard. And it just timing and everything was off. And they've started to get more confidence, better timing, better results. That's balanced out and allowed them to rely on the run more, and the offense has gotten going. And I think this is a time to sort of transition to the model. Our model takes all that into account, but it still does favor Alabama by a pretty significant margin. Now it's low scoring. Alabama 28, LSU 16. And from a yardage perspective, it's actually almost worse than that. It's 6.6 yards per play for Alabama. That's a pretty high mark. 4.2 yards per play for LSU. And that really does center around the defensive statistics. Alabama, 62% against the run. Tennessee is better than Georgia statistically, run defense, at least in this metric. And Tennessee's at 70%, Georgia's at 76%. So Alabama is a great run defense. They're an elite run defense. They kind of got, I think, exposed in their scheme against Tennessee, but that's really the one exception. And even there, they didn't get absolutely run over. And their pass defense is the relative weakness at 76%. That's still very good. It's just hard to hold teams to very far below their average. We talk a lot that 70% is about the cap. Realistically, the best ever might be somewhere around 65 to 70%. But LSU is 86% of opponent rushing averages, 97% of opponent passing averages. Those are not numbers that are good enough to really keep an opposing offense from doing kind of what they want to do. And now Alabama, interestingly, again, they've been either really hot or really cold. So Louisiana Monroe, Vanderbilt, Arkansas, they were like 8 to 10 yards per play, like just bonkers. Tennessee, even, they were 6.9 yards per play. And then Texas A&M, Texas, they're held under 6 or 5 point something. This number is actually closer to the Tennessee number than it is, for example, the Texas number. But the scoring differential there, 6.8 yards per play against Tennessee, 5.9 against Texas. That yard per play number is not that different between those two games, even though they scored over twice as much. And that gets into something we talk about a lot statistically, that there's these sort of freeze points and break points. And Alabama really, it's hard to tell where that number is. Like, this number is right at the point where Alabama might actually be able to break away and run rampant scoring. And it also might not be quite enough. They're projected to fall into a gray area we haven't quite seen them operate in yet. The problem for LSU is that 4.2 number is really low. The low watermark for LSU this year was the Auburn game. They were 3.6 yards per play. The next worst was the next week against Tennessee, but even then, that was 4.9. And that gets me into the point that I'm going to transition out of, and I think it's what the model's seeing. LSU's offense has very much played up and down to its competition. When you look at where Florida State was in the opener, I think you can kind of throw that out, but that was a pretty good defense. They've been a pretty good defense for the rest of the year, and despite all the weirdness of week one, that applies both ways, and they didn't move the ball great. But Mississippi State, a good defense, not much more. You score 31 points. New Mexico is a bad defense, score 38. Auburn, especially at that time, was pretty darn good. You only score 21. Tennessee, pretty good. I know, again, a lot of issues, but you only score 13. That's what the model's saying. And then Florida, Mississippi, those are bad defenses. And Florida is a bad defense. Ole Miss is a bad defense. Auburn ran all over Ole Miss. And so what the model is really saying here is, LSU's had a rebound, but they had 2 bad weeks offensively followed by 2 good weeks. And there is a very clear correlation between the quality of the defensive opponent faced in the 2 bad weeks versus the 2 good weeks. And that makes our model think, okay, you just kind of play up and down to competition. And so when I say that too, you have to realize where Alabama is. This is my last point before we segue. Alabama is a better offense and a better defense than LSU's used to. And in particular, Tennessee is a better offense statistically than Alabama, but the only one that's better. They're about 7.4 yards per play. Alabama's about 7. Alabama's a good half yard better, actually, than Ole Miss right now. So, but those are all games where the opposing team did move the ball pretty well on them. Or at least if you're halfway between Ole Miss and Tennessee, that 30-point expectation is not too far off. The problem is the defensive side of the ball. Alabama's number 1 in the conference in yards per play allowed. They're about 0.3 of a point better than Georgia. They're better than Missouri, better than Tennessee, better than Kentucky. Ole Miss is probably the best defense that LSU's faced. Even Auburn is not that high. So it's realistic, I think, from the model's perspective, that's just looking at numbers to say, this is the best defense that you faced by a good margin. The last time you faced a top 4 defense, or the only time you did, was Tennessee. They largely shut you down. Alabama's even better, should shut you down worse. Alabama's offense between Ole Miss and Tennessee should be able to score in the 20-something margin. And that's how you end up with this result. It really has to do with how much of an outlier Alabama is. Despite all their struggles, they are still an outlier statistically, and that's why you end up with, in our model, a 13-point margin, and in Vegas also about a 13-point margin.
And I will say, in LSU's defense, and you touched on it a little bit earlier, the Tennessee number is skewing things a little bit, and it's not entirely fair because of the things that happened in that game to start. I don't think it was a proper showing of who LSU is in that game. To me, the flip side of that, though, is I don't know that they're 45-20 better than Ole Miss, especially the way that game was going, right? I feel like if I'm looking at LSU this year, I think they're a much improved team from where they were at the beginning of the year. The Auburn game concerns me. Auburn dominated them in everything but the scoreboard, and you can't be dominated by Auburn, I don't think, and beat an Alabama. But, Josh, the flip side of this is, Alabama's been a double-digit road favorite a couple of times, Texas and Tennessee this year, and lost one and almost lost the other. At what point does Alabama's road struggles and the fact that they play so tight against, we saw this A&M last year, Auburn last year, it's not just this season, they play so tight, they put up 10, 12 penalties, stupid penalties, have turnovers, can't react to a middle blitz, all this stuff. At what point is that who Alabama is on the road, and they should be, a heads-up pick 'em against a good team on the road and might beat them by 3 touchdowns at home? Like, is that a thing, or is it that we're maybe putting too much weight into a couple of road struggles? To me, it's somewhat of a thing, but I want to hear you talk about it.
I do think it's actually somewhat of a thing, and I personally have this theory, having watched them a few times, and it didn't quite happen in the Tennessee game because I think they kind of knew what was coming. They do so many checks at the line of scrimmage. Like, their offense is really complicated. Clearly, what O'Brien has installed requires them to make a lot of protection calls. They make, I think, adjustments to the routes. They have a lot of faith in Bryce Young and his ability to run this offense. And we've said this a lot of different ways, a lot of times. I think he absolutely can run the offense. I think he's smart enough to do it. That doesn't mean it's a good idea to make it. And on the road, when you have to make all those calls in college where it's loud, frankly, it's a lot louder than it is in the NFL because there's more people in these stadiums and they can be a lot more raucous. I think it's too difficult for them to communicate on the road. It's too difficult for them to do all that and then try to snap the ball late in the snap count, and guys hold the position trying to hold their stance too long. And that's why they're having so many penalties, and that's why they're having so many just meltdowns on the offensive side of the ball. I think it's a thing. And then the question is, does Alabama kind of finally admitted that it's a problem? Have they admitted that this scheme and this level of complication is an issue? Because we flagged it for a solid year now. Going midway through last season, we started picking up on this. And they did the same thing again this year, which just baffled me and you, I know. I think it's really an extension of that. And I mean, the question is it really reasonable to think that they can go into Baton Rouge and then they can play at a high level and win by a good margin? And I'm not sure. And I think, honestly, I think that 13-point spread may reflect the fact that they think it's a 50% shot that Alabama wins by 2 touchdowns or more, and a 50% shot of Alabama possibly losing the game or going down to the absolute wire. I think that just sort of does Alabama, I think honestly in Vegas's eyes, and maybe even in my eyes, frankly, if this was a neutral site, I'd have Alabama pretty comfortably. But on the road, it's just sort of this open question of what you're going to get. And having said I'd have them comfortably in the neutral side, I need to explain that, and I'll probably go ahead and give my pick. I think what Kelly has brought to LSU is something they haven't had in a long time, and that's stability. Their team is playing generally to their potential on a weekly basis. They're not playing down to their competition so much. When they have advantages in terms of talent and scheme, they find ways to win. They grind it out. They don't do stupid things. They're alive at the end of the game. And, you talk about like the Ole Miss game, right? The other team just eventually sort of hands it to you, and you can run away with it because you're more talented. You've got more, it's kind of weird to say they have more depth because of where they're at in the spring. But I think they have more quality depth now, especially having how much they've used the transfer portal than most teams, because their backup guys are still high-level talent guys. They've got a lot of guys they can actually use. Some of these other rosters, like Ole Miss's roster, they can't. They're second-string players in a lot of positions they can't afford to have on the field. And LSU did a lot of stuff with Kelly to bring in, like, 15, 20 transfers that they've got a real too deep at a lot of positions. And they've got enough filler talent that was left over at high level that they can deal with that. And so that's gotten them to where they are. But Alabama is sort of a different beast. And this was Kelly's problem at Notre Dame. Their style of offense is sort of, don't screw it up, don't give away the game, stay in the game, keep the pressure on, wait for them to give the game to you. That works until it doesn't. And what we always saw at Notre Dame is when you played a high-level team that was explosive, if you sort of wait for them to take the game away, they'll take the game away. And they'll start running away with it. And it's suddenly you don't really know how to react. You can't, you punch and they punch hard, and you're not used to taking a haymaker, and you're not used to delivering one in response. And I think that's kind of LSU's problem. I don't know if they get up in a high-scoring game, if they end up in a game that's a real defensive slugfest where they can't afford any mistakes on the back end. I am not sure they're really equipped to do that against an actual Heisman Trophy winning quarterback, against a defense that has a tremendous ability to disrupt the passer. They are very fast defensively at Alabama, which is going to limit what Daniels can do. I think there's a lot of cards stacked against them in this game, and they just don't have, whereas Tennessee really got on Alabama because they were extremely explosive and they're extremely efficient in their explosiveness. They don't miss a lot of shots. Hooker has an incredibly accurate deep ball. Their timing and rhythm was awesome. Their tempo was really, really high, and they pushed and they pushed and they strained Alabama. LSU is not going to come out with high-level tempo and start just throwing shots downfield. It's not something I've ever seen Kelly done. I don't think it's something Daniels is comfortable doing. And if you're just trying to play with everything in front of you, that is a darn hard way to beat an Alabama or Georgia or an Ohio State. And that's why I do pick Alabama in this game. I'm going to pick them, honestly, I'm going to pick them 31-13, which somebody's going to scoff at that, but that's an 18-point margin and it's a 13-point spread. So I'm picking Alabama only to cover by 5 points. And you're honestly not all that far off from the over/under either. So that's where I'm at. I certainly could be wrong, but I think it's going to be a slog for Alabama to get to 31, truth be told. But I really don't think LSU is going to have much success offensively. I'm like you. I'm concerned by the Auburn game. I'm concerned by the matchups that they face versus Alabama's speed on the edges and how much that's going to limit Daniels. And I don't think LSU is going to be able to move the ball well enough to win this game.
There's two thoughts from me in terms of approach for this. One of them has me thinking that Alabama does come out of a bye, because if there was any team in the country that looked like they needed a bye week, it was Alabama 2 weeks ago. Like, the second half of that Mississippi State game was just kind of painful to watch. Bryce Young's been hurt. His shoulder being rested is probably good for him. So part of me thinks it's time for this Alabama team to put it all together. And what we saw last year when they struggled with checks at the line on the road with Auburn, they came out and ran tempo, like actual tempo against Georgia, and put up 41. I assumed that's where they would be offensively this whole year, but they have gone back to that. I wouldn't give the coaching staff credit to think that they're not so stupid that they can't see, because these are genius minds that have been around football their entire life. They can't see on film what we see every day and what the average fan sees, that snapping the ball 1 second left and letting the defense know when they're coming or when they need to go. Like, they've got to see this stuff, Josh. They have to. So part of me thinks that they correct all of that, and they come out and they're loose, and they put both sides of the ball together, and they stomp LSU. Part of me thinks two things. One, LSU's a good football team. They're a better football team than they're getting credit. I've got them in my top 10. I think you do too. I think that LSU's good at home, obviously. And I'm not convinced until they prove it otherwise in a night game against a good team. I'm not convinced Alabama's coaching staff isn't stubborn enough to do the same things that have kind of screwed them up so far. Like, fool me once, okay, but they've done it like 5 or 6 times now in the last couple of years. So I'll give this a tighter game than you, 27-20. I will remind people, I think the last time LSU actually beat Alabama in Baton Rouge was in 2010, Jordan Jefferson era. But I've got 27-20. I think Alabama on a neutral field, playing loose, is 3 touchdowns better than LSU. But until they prove it to me against a good team on the road that they're not going to do this check at the line crap, they're not going to drop passes and have 12 penalties, I have no faith in them doing it. And it's not like it's the second time. It's going to be the 6th or 7th time. Josh, like I did on the other one, in a parting shot, talk a little bit about if LSU could win this game, what it means for the SEC, for the division race and all of that, because it gets real interesting if Alabama drops this game.
Yeah. And I want to be clear. I mean, LSU's in my top 10. I think they're a really good team. I just think it's a tough route for them. You know, Daniels accounted for 250 yards passing, but also was the leading rusher by 50 yards. He had 120 yards rushing against Ole Miss. I just don't think it's a great matchup for him to be relied on that much. But I could be proven completely wrong. And if he goes off, which quarterbacks tend to do sometimes against these high-level teams, if Butte finally wakes up and becomes the downfield threat, I thought he was the best receiver in the country before he got hurt last year. They absolutely could win this game. But if they do win the game, well, then you've got a 2-loss LSU. You've got a 2-loss Alabama. LSU has the tiebreaker over Alabama. LSU has also beaten Ole Miss. So if Alabama beats Ole Miss, now LSU has the tiebreaker over Alabama and Ole Miss. So I'm pretty sure, unless I'm missing something, if everything else shakes out the way it should, LSU's going to be in the driver's seat for the SEC West SEC West crown, and they have a good shot to go to Atlanta. So the fact that Alabama's already lost actually very much means that LSU's right in the thick of things, right? In conference play, LSU, Ole Miss, and Alabama are all sitting there with 1 loss right now. I mean, I said 2 losses, right? But one of them is Florida State. So it's kind of still already everybody's game. The winner of this game, 1 loss or 2 loss doesn't really matter because Ole Miss only has 1 conference loss themselves, right? The winner of this game is going to be at a serious advantage. And if it's LSU, because they've already played and beaten Ole Miss, they've got a huge leg up on everybody else. Even if they drop a game, if Alabama beats Ole Miss, they still get the tiebreaker. So LSU, in many ways, is probably the biggest advantage of everyone going into this game because how well positioned they are if they beat Alabama. If Alabama wins, they've still got to turn around and beat Ole Miss, so this doesn't even matter. Ole Miss is going to be the one that ends up going to Atlanta. If everybody, all else is equal and all else wins out. I will say, even in that conversation, I still feel like there's zaniness to come. A lot of the best games are still to be played in the SEC West. Arkansas in particular hasn't played some of these teams, and I think that could be a huge factor going forward. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting how wide open it is with the upper half of the SEC West all really sitting there with one conference loss.
All right, that's it for y'all. For y'all on Alabama LSU. Want to remind y'all that we're going to do that hypothetical coming Wednesday, Iowa versus Texas A&M. Just tune in to hear us kind of beat both those teams up a little bit sarcastically and literally. Remember, live show Saturday night. Give us your score in the comments. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.